request or you need to connect directly with me, we ask that folks avoid using the chat. It does become distracting for folks using a screen reader and for anybody involved in the conversation. My final ask will be members that the first time you speak, you introduce yourself by full name, and any time after that, for benefit of those who may be listening to this rather than joining us on the Zoom in its entirety, that you let everybody know who is speaking anytime you do address the group. With that said, I want to give an overview of our approach to today's conversation, what the goal is, how we're going to get there, and share a little bit about how the other subcommittees who have met this week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, have approached their work. We're going to start off by providing a high-level overview of the feedback we received by the surveys online and through some letters that were sent directly from different state agencies, different individuals, and different organizations. As I share that out, it is not my intention to provide a full readout of every comment. I'll share what were some of the big themes and takeaways I read, and then I'll invite all of you to do the same. Once we've gone through the overall big picture conversation about the input, we'll then start going through each idea one by one. On all of the ideas, you have several options as a subcommittee. Number one, you can vote to advance the idea as a recommendation to the executive committee, exactly as written or with minor revisions. Number two, you could vote to advance it as a recommendation or propose substantial revisions to the idea. Number three, you could vote not to advance it as a recommendation, but instead to include a discussion of the item in the report. And finally, as I'll share some of the other subcommittees did, you have the opportunity to revise it and to combine it with other ideas. On that note, let me share a little bit about what the other subcommittees have done. And I don't share this to tell you that any approach they've taken is right or wrong, or that one is appropriate for this subcommittee, but just to give you an example of how we can approach this. One of our subcommittees, the CADA rewrite, almost entirely voted each idea up or down. They saw very little need to revise their ideas based on stakeholder input, and because their ideas were so specific in the changes to the CADA law, they voted to advance their ideas as recommendation. We've then since met with the Outdoor Recreation Committee and with the Housing Committee. Each of them took slightly different approaches. Some of them voted to do some rewriting and revising of their recommendations. So rather than voting on something that had not yet been rewritten, we discussed the language or the changes they thought were important, made note of those, and they'll be voting on some of those and the remaining ideas at their next meeting. In yesterday's housing meeting, they took a hybrid approach. There were some ideas they're prepared to move forward. There were a number of ideas that they sought to combine and consolidate. For example, they had a number of ideas that talked about needs for different types of enforcement and inspection. And so what they did was consolidated several of those ideas into a single idea around periodic inspections, reviews, and mandatory enforcement. They also had at least one idea that they said, having heard stakeholder feedback, they weren't ready to advance it as a recommendation to require a specific action, but they were prepared to advance it for further study and recommended for the recommendation that instead of a requirement, that specific idea be developed as exemplars and published for people to adopt on an optional basis. So these are all different approaches. If there's ideas that this group feels are ready to advance as recommendations to the executive committee, we will take a full roll call vote. For other ideas where they need revision or combining, we'll take those notes and we'll bring them back to you at the next meeting. The last thing I want to share is just a reminder of the process that is underway now. We will be submitting a report with your recommendations to the executive committee on Monday, December 2nd. At that time, they will engage in some further public input, and the executive committee will spend the month of December refining all of the recommendations, considering all of the recommendations from each subcommittee, as well as other ideas from members of the executive committee, and they will develop the final set of recommendations from the task force that will be published in a report no later than January 25th. So before I start the discussion of the feedback, does anybody have questions about the overall process for the task force or how we're approaching our conversations today? I'm not getting any, so let's get right into the discussion of the feedback. And I really want to hear from all of you primarily. So I'm going to keep my remarks brief. There are some comments that just came in today, so you haven't seen those. So as we get to individual ideas, I will read these out. Some of these came from city or town managers, and we're responding to some of the ideas about our requirements for local jurisdictions. I will also, when the time comes, read the language from the Secretary of State's office, because I don't know if all of you yet had a chance to read some of those. What I will share is that overall, I did not see a lot of instances where people providing feedback sought to build on, make stronger, or offer alternative proposals to what you all had put forward. A number of people simply expressed support and said these types of things, whether it relates to running for office, being employed in government, which are the two areas we'll focus on today, or as we get into public discussion and other items, people expressed support and thought that it was appropriate that these actions be taken. Others simply expressed opposition and said, I don't agree with this idea, while a number of people providing reaction focused on the cost or the resources that would be necessary to advance some of these. People said, for example, having a dedicated person responsible for certain things would be an undue burden. Or they said that providing these types of resources in every situation would be costly. I share these not to agree or disagree with any of them, but to give you what my key takeaways were. There were people who support your ideas as you've written them. There were people who opposed them with little explanation, and where there was specific explanation, it generally fell into two categories. Either the cost of it, or whether it was an appropriate expenditure of resources to do things in every situation rather on an as requested basis. With that said, as I noted, I really want to hear what some of your takeaways were as you read through some of the survey responses. So I'm going to go around the room, and I'm going to start, Chanda, with you, and then I'll go to Craig. And I'm curious, if you had a chance to look at these things, what were your takeaways on some of the response that you read? We are not getting your audio yet. Do you want me to come back to you? Okay. I will come back to Chanda. So Craig, I'm going to go to you, and then to Councilman Hines.
Hello, everyone. This is Craig. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Thank you, Craig.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, reading through the responses, I agree, Barrick, that they were pretty clear what the positions were with a lot of support. And then also a lot of the main pushback I saw was with funding constraints. And I think I just want to really, I think there's a misunderstanding for why we requested a lot of these things, especially with separate positions for ADA coordinator and separating that from risk management. I don't think there's a broad enough understanding of why that's important and actually where the conflict of interest lies. So I think we got to always remember that, yes, these things will cost more money, but we can't allow that to come at the expense of equal access. So no matter what the cost is, we have to look at what the cost is having resources that aren't accessible to everyone. And I think that it's money well spent that accessibility. So I think all of the, issues with budgeting and cost are not enough for me to want to make any kind of changes or compromises to our recommendations, because I think equal access should be paramount to the added financial burden. And I think there's money in other places. And I also thought that it looked like there was kind of the argument saying where the funding would have to come from other essential services, and it was kind of a this or that, when it should be a this and type of argument. And I think that's not a correct way to frame these conversations by saying, oh, if we have a new ADA coordinator, that's going to take away from other essential services paramount to public safety and infrastructure, is what I saw in some comments. And I just don't buy that argument. I think we can find funding, and it doesn't have to come at the expense of other essential services.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Craig.
So that's my initial response.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig. I'll go to Councilman Hines and then to Rob Hernandez.
Well, I think it's quite interesting that one of the comments was, as someone who's scheduled ASL interpreters for the past 15 years, I'm very concerned about interpreter availability. How present that comment is today. So, Barry, I want to go back to something that you said a couple meetings ago, and it was about how I was saying something about cost or whatever, and you said, whoa, actually, that's not what this is about. That's not what this stakeholder process is about. It is not about we're coming up with other people's arguments. We're not supposed to argue against ourselves. The idea is to propose something that works for the disability community. And frankly, it's not just the disability community. It's making sure that everyone has access to government, everyone has access to serving in government, and so it isn't, to Craig's point, it's not that we're trying to placate a small demographic. We're trying to make sure that government is representative of all the people, not just those convenient to represent. So that's thought number one is the quote about ASL interpreters. Thought number two is, our job is to provide the recommendation for the disability community. Thought number three is, people talking about financial issues. It's just going to cost too much. If we implement it in the next 5 years, maybe we could do 10 years. I would say, no, we've already burned through 34 years. And man, I mean, it's my name after all. Hindsight's 2020, and if we had found a way to come up with this funding for the last 34 years, that would be great. We haven't. Now that we're trying to say, hey, this is a conversation we should have, and now people are like, oh, it's too expensive. That continues to be a concern for me. 2 years ago, Denver City Council passed regulations requiring access to electric vehicle charging stations for people with disabilities. In the 2024 legislative session, Rep. Ortiz is here. I believe the General Assembly passed regulation at the state level mandating access to electric vehicle charging stations for people with disabilities. The U.S. Access Board has a recommendation right now at the federal level. Meanwhile, 20,000 electric vehicle charging stations have already been installed nationally with no regulations. And so, when I hear, man, it takes too much money or whatever, we are continuing to leave, in the EV charging station, conversation, we are continuing to leave a community behind. And as we talk about, well, geez, we need to slow down and slow down the process to make sure everyone's included. Well, we're not slowing down the implementation of electric vehicle charging stations. We're slowing down the process of making sure that everyone has access to it. And so, I bring that up because sometimes we're slowing down some conversations, but not slowing down other conversations. And I'm concerned about that too, that we're slowing down the conversation about implementation for a small, what theoretically is a small population, really, that 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. So it's not that small a population, but that, those continue to be concerns for me. The last thing I'd mention, which is very present conversation right now, is there's a conversation about fully renovating the Denver City Council chambers. And it is being funded through ADA funds, so funds that we got from the federal government for accessibility. I have not been involved in any of those conversations at all. And I'm one of the 13 people on council. And then also, so this was in committee 2 weeks ago, continues to be a very present, it's a conversation right now. Our Office of Disability Rights was also not included in that conversation. And it turns out I got a little bit of context behind it. It was originally meant to be a technology change because we've got cables. It's a historic building. We have cables running around the city council desks. And so the project originally was just to make sure that we can get rid of we can put those cables in a safer place. Well, technology doesn't require an ADA, or running cables doesn't require an ADA review, but now it's far bigger. It's a complete redesign. We're adding doorways. We're adding for egress. Some of that for accessibility, some of it for safety. And so we've omitted the disability community. So we can have cost kind of thoughts or concerns. And I guess at the end of the day, our budget, has to, at the local and state level, it has to be a balanced budget. My biggest frustration is that we continue to have conversations about the disability community, even when we elect people and theoretically they're meant to be in the, at the table when the conversations are happening, and yet it's still not happening. So, so that gives me more pause as an elected official. It gives me, I believe, more interest in this recommendation and making sure that this recommendation that the purpose of 1296, that it moves forward and ensures that everyone, including people with disabilities, has access, and we don't kind of water it down because it's too expensive or just because on principle it's a bad implementation. So those are kind of my thoughts. I know that was a little bit longer, but I hope you don't mind.
That's okay. Thank you, Councilman. I'm going to go to Chanda next because I think she's got her audio worked out. I just want to respond to a few things you said. Number one, I think you raised something that you all may want to consider as we finalize the ideas into recommendations. You raised the point about a lot of discussions and decisions happening without those affected or with lived experience being involved in the process. So I would invite you to consider including that in your ideas that become recommendations if you would like. And I appreciate you raising, my comments, which are sincerely held. It's not your job to figure out if this can be afforded. Now, when we put our report forward, it will name the problem we're working to solve. It will name the end state working to be reached. If you as a group decide that it's an appropriate item that may take time, that can't be fully solved with an immediate action, I will invite you to include in that report, here is the minimum first step that must be taken. But on that point of the aspirational or bold level of the ideas and the cost, I will tell you, having run 50 plus of these task forces, rarely have I seen somebody after these ideas are put forward say, I know you only asked for $1 million, but let me give you 5 million instead. Nor have I ever seen somebody said, I know you asked for this to be done in 5 years. We're going to make it happen even faster. So this is the place to be bold. The executive committee will look at a lot of the pragmatic factors, and certainly we all know what will happen, whether these are legislative or regulatory issues, what will happen then. So please focus on the end state and the aspirational goal we're trying to get. But with that, let me bring it back to what you took away from the feedback, and I'm going to loop back to Chanda, and then Rob, I'll come to you after Chanda.
This is Chanda. Can you hear me now?
We sure can. Thank you.
Okay, good. I think that the biggest takeaways is that I think a lot of it was supportive in collaboration to what things have already been said. I do think that there was some, feedback that they couldn't get in depth into the pieces of the conversations that we've went through. So I think that some of those you just have to take at the level at which the feedback is, because we couldn't give them all of the context to the various pieces that we all dove into. So I think that was one piece that we just have to be mindful of. And then, I know that you just reiterated the funding component, but I do think that with the funding component, if we don't really push hard and not make that be the primary issue, we're going to hit that forever. I think that one thing, again, and Chris made it very direct too, is that when we think about budgeting for people and the accommodations around disability, we have to remind ourselves that it's not just disability. This is for aging, all temporary, everything. And so I think that if we don't push deep on that, and knowing that this is the whole purpose of this task force is to do exactly what it is that we're doing and to think bold and go all the way. I think that if that piece continues, or if that becomes one of the bigger barriers, then there's a whole deeper discussion about why are we not willing to put money towards the needs of the accommodations that we all collectively as a task force are saying need to be done. So that would be just my feedback to all of it.
Thank you. Rob and then Shannon. Rob, what did you take away from the stakeholder feedback?
Well, there's two words that come to my mind, and that's reactive and proactive. Okay. When we're proactive, it's because we're doing the right thing, and so we're following the law. But it's not just because we're following the law; it's because we're doing the right thing. And when you take the proactive position, believe it or not, there's lots of cost savings. Okay, rather than when you're reactive, there's consequences. And with consequences, there comes more added cost. So one of the things that keeps clicking in my mind is what Representative Ortiz said several meetings back. Rob, I don't want to hear that anymore. I know it's the federal law, but yet here we are. He was absolutely right. That clicked when he said that. Yet here we are, right? So an example here in the city, they hired me because it was reactive, not proactive. Okay. They had one person here in ADA working out of risk. Okay. And they hired me because I was making good changes in the county. I took a different approach. I involved the community with disabilities to help provide solutions how to make changes for the county to do the right thing. By doing that, I'm eliminating a lawsuit. Okay. I'm not only doing the right thing, but I'm also doing the right thing for the taxpayers as well. So that didn't happen with the city. Okay. They got sued, and millions of dollars later, okay, they brought me in, and what I noted was, okay, I need to be out of this office. I need to be a standalone office of accessibility is what I called it. ADA. We need qualified people. I remember meeting with the mayor and explaining to the mayor what I was going to do, how, what, where, and where we were, and that I was going to do a self-evaluation transition plan. And then when I came back to brief him, he's looking at the big picture now, and he looks at the directors, and pardon my French, he says, how in the hell did we get to this? This is stupid. Why are we're paying millions of dollars. Why do we even get this? Why did we do the ped ramps right to begin with, the sidewalks? And he's going down the list that I have, right? The public works director turned to him and says, sir, to be blunt, we did not have ADA experts. We didn't have subject matter experts that knew what the ADA was and how and what was needed. We do now. Unfortunately, it's now and not before. So we're having to fix this now. And since then, we're the leading city now. Okay. But my point is, you have to have the right person for the job. And Councilman Hines made it a point to say, you know, we're not even being involved in some of these decisions and some of these meetings, which is, I've fought that battle, and it shouldn't be a battle. You know, it's kind of like I'm a prior military guy myself. You know, I can use a little bit of air support here. You know, I need some air support. I'm in a battle, and I could use that support right now. And I wish the DOJ was a little bit more aggressive on some of the stuff, because when it's standard, I can tell the leadership this is required by law. But when you get into these areas where it's ambiguous, I have to try to convince them that it's the right thing, and this is why. My point is that we need to have the experts in the right place with the right support. Otherwise, we're having to force our way in there, and we know that that doesn't always work. where if we're at the table and we're part of that conversation, you know, we know that as engineers, for instance, if we engineer it in the beginning, we eliminate those problems, hopefully, right? But if we have to fix it afterwards, the cost is much heavier. So that's what I got out of this is I saw some of these things and they could be addressed by getting the right people in the right place. And that's really what counts here. Hope
Councilman,
that helps.
Councilman, did you want to respond, or do you want me to come to you after I go to Shannon?
Yeah, I did want to just say, you mentioned the cost is higher. The cost is higher in one of two ways. The cost is higher financially because then we have to rip things out and do it again the right way, or it's higher because then we exclude a protected class. And
Right.
either way, the cost is higher. But like when I was talking about electric vehicle charging stations, my concern is that someone at some point, once we finally pass federal regulation, someone will say, oh, we've already installed 50,000 EV charge. We can't go back and redo 50,000 EV charging stations. So then we'll just be left out. So it's cheaper financially, and it's the right thing to do it right the first time. Thank you.
Understood. Yeah, no, and I apologize. I'm going to move us along so I can get Shannon's thoughts on the feedback, and then I want to get into the ideas where some of these things you're bringing up may well come into play. Shannon, what did you take away from the feedback we got?
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you. My name is Shannon, and I'm calling in through the phone. And my thoughts on the feedback is that we already know. There's nothing new there. And many of the feedback here is stuff we're already aware of and that we already recognize as being an issue and having concerns: budget, timelines, who's responsible, who, what, when, where, why. But the problem that the people filling this out is they don't have the perspective of problem solving, of how to solve the problem or the issue. So now there's all these concerns. Yes, I understand there's concerns, but how do we do it? So if it's a budget issue, then where do we get the money? If it's a time issue, okay, then let's work a little bit to break it up into parts that we can make it manageable time-wise. So I think we need to pull in their thoughts and perspectives on how we can solve the issues, help with understanding and figure out where those barriers are or where those deficits are to improve that process. So, you know, as we were getting closer and, you know, when the issues are solved, people will say, oh, we can do this, we can make these changes, and how can we apply this to new issues that come up that need to be solved? So the word in the deaf community that we hate is you can't, because that blocks our lives. That applies to this as well. You know, oh, I can't do this or I can't do that. No, we can always solve the problem if we're willing to try. So it's just a matter of how do we solve the problem. And a lot of the people on these committee feel the same way. Oh, we can't because of this. We can't because of this. And it's like, I don't buy the can't.
Thank you, Shannon. With that, I think all of your combined comments and takeaways position us perfectly to start the discussion of the ideas. And as I said, you have several options. You can vote to advance the idea as is. You can vote to make either minor or substantial revisions based on the feedback and discussion, or you can vote not to advance it as a formal recommendation or to combine it with others. What I will do is read you the idea as shared with the public and some of the key feedback that I know most of you, if not all of you, have read. And then I'm going to ask you to volunteer for your thoughts on what we should do with this idea. Because we have so many ideas to get through and a lot of discussion, I am going to ask everyone to be really efficient with your words and as succinct as possible. And if you simply agree with what someone else has said, feel free to just say, I agree with what the last person said. But the first idea on deck: require state agencies and encourage local governments. So I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. Idea number one: require that any venue or facility being used for an official campaign event or element of a campaign be ADA compliant, and that such compliance be certified by an appropriate government body, the state, county, city, or town, rather than allowing self-certification. If no such facilities are available, the jurisdiction holding the election should provide an accessible and compliant venue. And I think you'll all recall this came up in part because of what Councilman Hines experienced at some debates, and in part because of stories we heard elsewhere, where people had said, yes, this is a compliant venue, when in fact it was not. In looking at the feedback we got, a lot of it rode on two areas. Number one, the cost of doing this. And number two, what I think was some confusion, and I will own some ambiguity in how we wrote this. Folks responded saying you can't expect every campaign coffee at a private individual's home to be required to be inspected. I don't believe that's what any of you meant. I believe you meant that these were official sanctioned things like the official debates or other opportunities like that. So I'd invite, if anybody wants to clarify it. The other feedback we got, in addition to supporting this, which was a lot of the feedback, were other folks saying that ensuring that something is compliant could be costly, and we would need to be clear who was responsible for conducting those inspections and maintaining them as current. I will offer to you that you don't need to name every enforcement mechanism. Part of that will be on the executive committee. Your task is to state the end state you're trying to create with your recommendation and what the standard of performance should be there. Councilman Hines, let me go to you first and then to Rob.
The you mentioned in the proposed recommendation, if there isn't a venue, then the local entity should, or the entity should provide. I would change that to shall instead of should. If that's my suggestion for a change. That's an important distinction. Shall means they have to. Should is like Yoda, they'll try. And yeah, so I agree with you. The intent is official functions. As an example, the Fair Elections Fund, to qualify for the funds, you shall participate in these debates. So it isn't meant to be every campaign event at someone's home or whatever. It is meant to be if there is a required function or a government sponsored or government initiated event, that's what falls into this. Thank you.
Thank you. Rob.
Yeah, I mean, Councilman Hines just summed it up pretty much. Quick example of that. We're having a fire, what is it, a fireman's graduation, right? And they've decided to hold it in this facility that's not government or a government related facility. Okay, before we do so, they reached out to us, ADA, to say, hey, does this meet the requirements of the ADA? If we invite the public, is it going to be accessible? Whether it's captioning, looping, ASL, mobility. So that's where the ADA experts go in, evaluate, come back to our government, our leadership, and say yes or no, or if no, this is what needs to happen. Simple, because it's official. It's going to be an official government capacity.
Great.
Thank you. This is Craig. I just had a follow-up question. I saw the Fair Campaign Practices Act mentioned multiple times in some of the comments, and I was wondering how relevant that is to the second part with the jurisdiction holding the election should or shall provide an accessible, compliant venue if one can't be found. So is that really relevant, or how does that work into this? Because I wasn't super familiar with that act.
Craig, could you explain a little bit more your question? Are you asking, would this violate, or is this part of?
Yeah, would it truly violate? Because from some of the comebacks or comments, it says this rule would create legal liability for a government under the Fair Campaign Practices Act. And I was curious how true that was.
So, and I want to be very clear, although I've worked in politics and policy for 30 plus years, I am not a lawyer. I will also say You all are free to put forward recommendations, and we will let the exec committee, ledge council, and the legislature deal with that. But my understanding, Craig, is that one, the pushback was based on the confusion that maybe we were talking about all campaign events, like a fundraiser at somebody's house, and putting limits or restrictions on what a candidate could do might step into the FCPA. I don't, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to offer a legal opinion, but on my 30 years, I don't think there's anything in that act that requiring a jurisdiction to provide the venue for an officially sanctioned event. What could is if a city or town said, hey, Craig, you're running for office, let us provide you a place to do your fundraiser. Somebody could raise a complaint under the FCPA there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just a clarifying question because I wasn't super familiar with that act, so, and I saw it come up a couple times. Thank you.
I'm sensing some general consensus on this one. So what I'd like to put to the group is the question of, with the clarification that this is only speaking to official sanctioned functions and events, like those required debates or others, and us changing from election should provide and accessible to shall provide. By a quick show of hands, should we vote, take a formal vote on this? And Shannon, I welcome you to speak if you would say yes to that. I'm seeing a check mark. Here's what I'm going to do, seeing general agreement on this. I'm going to go ahead with a roll call vote. And the vote will be to advance the idea as a recommendation with the minor revision to clarify this is for officially sanctioned or required events, and that the jurisdiction holding election shall provide an accessible and compliant venue. And I will ask each person for a yes or no vote on that idea being a recommendation from this committee. Chanda. That's a yes. Councilman Hines.
Yes.
Councilman Hines, yes. Karen is not with us. Craig.
Yes.
Craig is a yes. Rob Hernandez.
Yes.
And Shannon Callahan.
Yes.
Thank you, Shannon. By unanimous vote, the first idea to require compliant, ADA compliant venues for official campaign events will move forward as a recommendation. I will now go to our second idea. Require that every jurisdiction in Colorado designate a single individual or office that serves as the ADA compliance officer for the entire jurisdiction. We had feedback that ranged from we already do this to I didn't know this was such a thing to requiring this would be increased administrative burdens and costs, and a number of folks that focused on the cost of doing so. Some others saying that there was no reason to require it be a single office. I will first ask for any discussion of this item or of the feedback before we contemplate going to a vote. Does anybody want to express a point of view on this in favor or opposed based on our previous discussions or based on the feedback that you read? Shannon, to you first.
Yes. Shannon here. Just to clarify, so I think it's a question of, is every town required to have just one individual, which I think, can be overwhelming, maybe changing it to every region where we're having like, I don't know, maybe like 10,000 people in an area is required to have one. Just having that tier will maybe help, to where they have, as opposed to having every town having just one, like say if there's only 500 people, does it really require to have one? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
I appreciate that, Shannon. We'll open that up to the group. And you may recall we had this very discussion as a committee of should this be a either scaled in thing that starts at counties and works its way down to municipalities? Should there be a table created of based on the population size or the head count of the government? And what I will say is you're free to make that suggestion, and I don't want you to feel obligated to name exactly what that scaling is. But other thoughts on this idea? Yes, Chanda, please. We got a tiny bit of sound, but it was super quiet.
Okay.
We may have you there, Chanda. Do you want to try talking? All right, Chanda, I'm going to come back to you. Looks like she dropped off and maybe rejoining us. Rob, your thoughts on this one?
So the standard practice for an ADA coordinator to have one, Title II ADA coordinator, is 50 or more employees. So if you get a municipality, it has, like, for instance, Manitou Springs, they're I think 83 employees, right? They have one ADA coordinator. But let's say you get to the city where we're at, over 500,000. Well, one ADA coordinator is not going to cut it. Maybe I'm the manager, so I have 3 other coordinators to be able to tackle what needs to be, done. But then you get into the opposite, where you might have a town that might have 10 employees. So yeah, that would be burdensome to them. So what's done in those cases usually is there might be several towns within that region, and they together will come together to hire an ADA coordinator for services, to be able to do an evaluation, a transition plan, to be able to answer questions and whatnot. And that way it's physically able to happen. So that's all looked at. That's why the DOJ says 50 or more employees. I think that's a good standard practice.
Okay. Councilman Hines and then Chanda.
Yeah, question for Rob. Is that documented somewhere? Is that is it just a best practice, or is it written down?
It's written down, and I can find it and send it.
Yeah, it sounds like perhaps we don't need to come up with a chart. There's already a chart created for us.
There is, and a lot of this stuff is already there, but going back to what Representative Ortiz says, that's great, but we as a state need to take ownership and do it ourselves.
Chanda.
This is Chanda. I was wondering if we could just reference reference with existing and standing requirements that are already out there, maybe, because I think that way we as a committee don't have to determine that, knowing that there's some things that exist, but yet we want to reference those. And I don't know if that's really required in that, but I think that might be an appropriate add to that recommendation. And because I think, we got to think about capacity, because can you read it just out loud one more time?
Absolutely. And I'm also going to read the next one, because
Okay.
I think you all may want to consider these two together. I will also say, Chanda, to the point you're making and that Rob has made, there is certainly nothing that prevents you all from saying, we know this is already a requirement in ADA law. Our recommendation is that Colorado enforce and have a system to ensure that this is what takes place in every jurisdiction. But
Yes.
the 2 ideas I want to read, this one was
Maybe
required that,
enforceable and auditing.
I think you can definitely put that in there. The 2 ideas, number 1, require that every jurisdiction in Colorado designate a single individual or office that serves as the ADA compliance officer for the entire jurisdiction. So the idea was that there is one umbrella person. If it's a small jurisdiction, maybe it's at that 50 point, there is just the one. As Rob suggested, you may have a jurisdiction significantly large that they have multiple ADA compliance officers. This talks about somebody being I guess the umbrella. The other idea that kind of intersects reads as follows: require that every jurisdiction in Colorado have an employee whose sole position is ADA coordinator. Where the jurisdiction's total headcount is below a to be determined threshold, allow the person to serve in multiple capacities, with the exception that no person shall serve as both ADA coordinator and risk management, or other role that may reasonably be seen as in conflict with the duties of the ADA coordinator. There was a note included that says this may require a timeline for compliance that may phase in county positions ahead of city or town in smaller jurisdictions, in which case the timeline for implementation should describe the role of such county officials in supporting the cities or towns until or unless they fill such roles. And I'm reading those two together because one is about having the single individual who oversees ADA compliance throughout the jurisdiction. The other idea you put forward as a group was clarifying that that person should not be the risk management officer. Let me go to Craig and then Rob for comment.
Thank you. This is Craig. Yeah, I agree that I think those two could be combined. And then just kind of going back to the feedback, I don't think it's, as this committee, it's our responsibility to figure out all the details and funding structures and nitty-gritty. There's other people that have the data and information to do that. I think I want to continue to reiterate that our purpose is to remove barriers to access for people with disabilities. And by not having these roles solidified and having conflict of interest with risk management, those are barriers to access. So I think we need to push for a recommendation for these two new requirements, always focusing on what is going to increase access for people with disabilities. And these are obvious barriers that have been identified. So I think we just want to always keep that in our recommendations. And it's really easy to feel like we have to think through all the details and nitty-gritty implementation when that's really not what matters at this phase. And it's important at some point, but I think right now, if it's a barrier, then we need to recommend it being removed or changes to it.
I agree, and I want to underscore that the charge of this subcommittee is to identify the barriers or challenges and the solutions to removing those barriers. Not how they get done, not who pays for it, not how it gets paid for. Your job is to find the solution. In just a couple of minutes, I'll read what a potential combination should be. But first, I want to go to Rob and then Shannon, because I know you don't have the same means to raise your hand. I'll also always come to you in case you have something you'd like to add. Rob, to you first on these combined two ideas.
I actually forgot to lower my hand.
Okay, fair enough. Shannon, anything on this you want to offer?
Not really much. Shannon here. So I know Craig, you pretty much said that fully. I think we just need to get both of those together and just to figure out how we are going to present that. But I think it should be fine. Okay.
Then here's what I'm going to propose to the group. I don't feel that this is substantive revisions that would require rewriting coming back to the vote. But if you do, I want you to feel very comfortable pushing back on me. I think what we can do is revise item number 2, which was require that every jurisdiction designate. Instead, picking up on the language I heard from several of you, require the auditing and enforcement of the ADA requirement that there be an ADA compliance officer. I think we can title this recommendation ADA compliance officers, and it's got 2 parts. Require the auditing and enforcement of this requirement, and require that every jurisdiction have someone whose sole position is as the ADA coordinator. Continue with the rest of the language. Where the jurisdiction's headcount is below a certain threshold, allow the person to serve in multiple capacities. However, no person shall serve both as ADA coordinator and risk management officer, with the other continuing language, and note that this may require a timeline for compliance and description of the roles between counties and cities. Is everyone comfortable, or does anyone have a concern with combining those and going to a vote on it? Okay. Councilman Hines.
I apologize. Will you
No.
read that again? I'm sorry. I'm more a visual learner, but I also recognize that not everyone here can see it visually. So, but
Absolutely. And this will be one of those rare times where I say, feel free to reference the chat. I'm going to paste in there the document that was shared with all of you with the language in it that had the survey response. But essentially, we would be changing, require that every jurisdiction in Colorado designate a single individual, and instead have it read, require the auditing and enforcement of ADA requirements that there be a single individual or office that serves as the ADA compliance officer, and require that each jurisdiction have an employee whose sole position is ADA coordinator, where the jurisdiction's total FTE, full-time employee count, is below a to be determined threshold, allow that person to serve in multiple capacities, with the exception that no person shall serve as both ADA coordinator and risk management, or other role that may reasonably be seen as in conflict with the duties of the ADA coordinator. Final note on that one, that this may require a timeline for compliance that may phase in county positions ahead of city or town in smaller jurisdictions, in which case the timeline for implementation should describe the role of such county officials in supporting cities or towns until or unless they fill such roles.
I support the added components.
And with that, I will go to a roll call vote. And I'll mix it up at some point, but for now, I'm just going in the list of my spreadsheet. So Chanda, to you first.
Yes.
Mr. Hines,
yes.
Mr. Towler,
Yes.
Mr. Hernandez,
Yes.
Mr. Callahan,
Yes.
by unanimous vote, the combined ideas, number 2 and 3 in the survey, for an ADA compliance officer now to require the auditing and enforcement of their presence and that they not be in a conflicting role, will move forward as a recommendation. With that, I will move us to our next idea. And with this one, because it directly involves a state agency, I will share their feedback on it. Idea number 4, direct the Secretary of State to establish a single, fully accessible, multiple format resource outlining all election and campaign processes, requirements, and information. The Secretary of State, in their feedback to us, provided the following. The department strives to provide a centralized and accessible resource outlining election and campaign processes through various subsections of the Secretary of State's website, and more specifically for voter information at govotecolorado.gov. The department also maintains robust guidance for potential candidates as the website's candidates homepage. To the extent the subcommittee feels that the voter resources on the Secretary's website are incomplete or could otherwise be improved, the department is happy to receive and implement specific guidance. The department continuously seeks to make complete election and campaign information easily accessible to voters and potential candidates, and welcomes any feedback which furthers this goal. As noted in previous sections, the task force should bear in mind, however, that many aspects of elections in Colorado are outside the Secretary's jurisdiction. For example, elections conducted in home rule counties and municipalities and in statutory towns are not subject to the Secretary's jurisdiction. In addition, while some aspects of elections for special districts are subject to some oversight by the Secretary, those elections are more directly regulated by the Colorado Department of Local Affairs. Mr. Hines.
So 2 things. One, I hear that the Secretary of State says that this administration is already compliant. Good. Let's have legislation that supports the good work of this administration, so that if there is a future administration that doesn't think that it's important, they're required to comply. So that's thought number 1. Thought number 2 is I wonder if the the state has purview over, whoever responded, I was going to say she, but whoever responded talked about they don't have direct purview over local elections. I mean, there could be, I think civil rights are a national and state responsibility and should not be entrusted to local government. And so if we are considering state law, state civil rights law, we could direct the same for clerks, county clerks as well. So, that administer elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Before I go to Chanda, I want to just react to what you shared. It clearly, as written, we say direct the Secretary of State to establish. To your point, simply directing a Secretary of State who is already doing it under one elected official, would you then propose the change in the idea when it becomes a recommendation to require in law that the Secretary of State, rather than just directing one to? And on your other question, I know there have been some legal questions raised of what the state can require local jurisdictions to do. I will simply offer to this group, I would not encourage you to water down or backwalk any idea out of a legal concern. If it's found not to be constitutional or legal, let that happen at exec committee or ledge council. But on the first part, would you suggest, Councilman, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, I just want to make sure I capture it, that rather than just saying direct the Secretary of State, should we say require that the Secretary of State establish and maintain?
I would. Thank you for that suggestion. And perhaps the recommendation could share the thanks of the current administration. As we have a requirement, we've received a response from the current secretary that they're already in line. That's great. We're doing this to protect this secretary and to ensure other secretaries who come behind will also be compliant. And then again, I think there's a pretty strong case that civil rights should never be a matter of local control. And in 2014, the General Assembly felt the same, as in that was the year when House Bill 1029, the one that I worked on, where we made parking for people with disabilities a matter of statewide concern, because before then, Colorado was the only state in the nation that allowed their municipalities to override and water down the state's disabled parking laws. So but you're right, the courts can sort it out.
Yeah, and I will just offer there, and again, I am neither a legislator nor ledge counsel, but I think there is room to include a legislative declaration that we find it is a civil right, and therefore it would trickle down to. Chanda.
This is Chanda. I think you pretty much touched on what I was going to recommend. The only thing I was curious about is whether we need to call out anyone or any additional language other than Secretary of State, just because it sounds like from certain response, they did reference other levels of entity. And I just want to make sure that it's like, when we're making a recommendation, we're making, we're indicating that requirement. I want to just make sure that we're calling out the right entity or any one entity that might be also in collaborate. I just think that because they mentioned in the response there was, and so I want to make sure that we're not requiring of a piece of it, but rather the bigger portion of it. And so, and again, I always go back to, if we're going to require something, what level of assurance can we indicate that if we require it, it is actually being in compliance of, which then I'm not a fan of like constant audits. It's annoying, but I feel as though one of the pieces about the work that we do as disability is that there's a lot of requirements, but because there are no audits, nothing gets monitored and nothing gets changed, or people just don't comply. So that would be my follow-up to those pieces.
So Chanda, two thoughts. One, I don't want you all to feel that you have to determine the method of enforcement other than naming that there must be a rigorous means of auditing and enforcement. I just put language in the document that I would float to the group to get to your second point. This could be written to say, require the Secretary of State and any official responsible for overseeing elections within the state of Colorado to establish and maintain, which if you wanted to go that direction, could get at the issue that Sec State's office and you touched on, that there are some municipal elections that are not directly managed by the Secretary of State. So publishing the resources would be done at potentially a municipal level. Craig.
Thank you. This is Craig. Yeah, as reading the question, would it be smart to go into more detail about fully accessible and actually outline what the multiple formats we're referring to, so there's no misunderstanding and there can be consistency? Because I find that there's a lot of, when you say fully accessible, there's a misinterpretation, and we're going to get a reaction of a lot of people saying, oh, well, we already do that, but it might not be truly inclusive of true accessibility. For example, I know the Secretary of State doesn't offer Braille resources, and I haven't seen any plain language versions. So would this be appropriate to go into more detail and actually list out what the multiple formats should be?
I think you can. I would offer to you, I think there's three paths at least you could go down. One, you could list, and I would always encourage people to say, and including but not limited to, because anytime you just list something, people say, I don't have to do anything else. You could have an including but not limited to, and name everything from Braille or other items that come to mind. So you could go down the path of listing things. You could simply say that it needs to be in multiple formats and task either the executive committee, the legislature, or these bodies with defining them. Or you could choose, and I guess those are really the two primary directions. In fact, either list them. I would encourage you, if you do list them, to provide some language about and other needs as may be identified in the future. I don't think for 20 years ago we would have thought about some of the advanced technologies today. So that's a path that you could go down, is to name them and suggest that they be kept current. The other way that we could approach this is keep the recommendation as written, but for each recommendation, we're going to have you not just say, this is the problem we're solving and the recommendation. We're also going to have you include notes about implementation, that we think it's important when this be implemented that the following things be considered. So you could include that there, since we're not trying to write legislation ourselves.
Thank you.
Shannon, do you have thoughts on this idea to require the Secretary of State and other officials responsible for overseeing elections to establish a single, fully accessible, multiple format resource outlining all of the election and campaign processes, requirements, and information?
Yes, I do. This is Shannon. I think the concept is great. It's easy, it's simple, it's clear. However, it can also be a little bit confusing. One example being that when an agency is required to provide an interpreter, that's great. Sure, yeah, they're required to provide an interpreter, but is the interpreter certified? Is an in-state interpreter? Is an out-of-state interpreter? Is the interpreter 2 or 3 hours away? Are they local? Are they competent? Do they have knowledge of the subject matter? So it leads to more question. Is it a good fit? Is it a good resource? So that's kind of like this. So the formatting is the same thing, but who makes the decision on what's appropriate formatting? If the secretary decides, oh yeah, we provide this one, but we're not going to provide those ones, but we'll provide the last one. And if it is not accessible to some people, so what does accessibility mean? So I like the idea, but I do think we need to get some more specifics about what would be appropriate.
Shannon, a question for you, and this is not me trying to steer, this is just floating an idea. What would you think about keeping the recommendation as we've revised it to require the Secretary of State and others responsible, but in an implementation note, directing each of them to form an advisory committee of those with lived experience to help inform the formats that these will be offered in.
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
Other reactions to that idea? And again, I want to be very clear. I'm not a member of the subcommittee. I'm trying to pull threads from what I'm hearing and offer some solutions. Craig.
Yeah, I love that idea to have some language in the implementation to require a working group of diverse community members with lived experience to continuously look at the definitions and provide recommendations on those multiple formats as it evolves over time, and then maybe put some language in to make sure it's reviewed periodically to make sure that the updates are getting in there. So I don't know if every year is too quick or every 5 years, but some sort of language that shows that it's evolving with the time, so it's continuing to be as inclusive as possible.
Councilman Hines.
Thank you, Chris Hines. And thanks for everyone but me for identifying themselves before. I'm sorry that I haven't already done that. This is probably too late in this process but I had this thought of I know the city of Denver has a lot of work on EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Our airport has DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. I don't know if there's a way for us to encourage on the record the accessibility element when governments are considering diverse communities. I mean, part of me was thinking, man, wouldn't it be great if we have this stakeholder group? We also had communities of color, and other underserved communities, our indigenous population represented. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, it actually should be the other way, because they already have a bunch of these committees. And rarely, if ever, do I see the disability community included in what is otherwise considered an underserved community.
Thank you, Councilman. And we may not be able to get to a formal recommendation in this, but there is nothing, if you all direct Carrie and me that way, there is no reason we can't include in the opening remarks and sections of the report from this subcommittee language that specifically highlights the advantages of DEI initiatives being expanded to be DEIA, so that this work doesn't exist in a silo.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, what I'd like to do is go to a vote. And if you're looking at the document, and I'm happy to read, it looks like a lot of comments. It's minor revisions. We would, instead of directing the Secretary of State, require the Secretary of State and any official responsible for overseeing elections within the state of Colorado to establish a single, fully accessible, multiple format resource outlining all election and campaign processes, requirements, and information. We would further suggest a legislative declaration that this is a matter of civil rights, and an implementation note that further directs each such individual to form and obtain the guidance of subject matter experts and those with lived experience to inform their approach and to review such efforts periodically. If everyone is okay with those revisions, I'll go to a roll call vote. And Chen, I'll give you a break, and I'm going to go backwards on this one. First, to Shannon Callahan.
Yes, Shannon here.
Thank you. Mr. Callahan, yes. Mr. Hernandez.
Yes.
Mr. Hernandez, yes. Mr. Towler.
Yes.
Mr. Towler, yes. Mr. Hines.
Chris Hines, yes.
Thank you much. And Chanda Hinton. Ms. Hinton, I couldn't hear you, but I saw your lips move, and I'm going to call that a big nodding, smiling yes. So by a unanimous vote, the idea to require this or this centralized resource at the state and local level to declare it a civil right and to ensure that there are those with lived experience who inform it will advance as a recommendation. We have 10 minutes. What I'm going to do is spend 5 minutes starting the next discussion. I'm not going to be bold enough or offensive enough to suggest that that's quick enough or enough time to get through a recommendation. I'm also, Representative Ortiz, going to hold a few minutes at the end if there's anything you'd like to say to the group as we finish out. But the next idea that we will get to, we'll start now, we'll get to on our next call. Direct the Secretary of State to develop and maintain a guide of ADA and CADA compliance requirements and accessibility best practices for use in any jurisdiction that conducts elections in the state of Colorado. The Secretary of State's office, and Mr. Hines, you're right, it wasn't the Secretary herself, it was someone in her office. They responded as following. The department currently maintains compliance and best practice guidelines and polling place ADA compliant voting options, website ADA compliance, and other ADA compliance information. It is feasible for the department to consolidate and promulgate a guide of its existing resources. However, the use of the word jurisdiction in the idea or recommendation creates some ambiguity. Is this meant to encompass only jurisdictions that coordinate their elections with county clerks under Title I of the Election Code, or does it include cities, towns, and special districts whose elections are administered under different statutory provision? Pursuant to CRS 11107A, the Secretary of State is an office of limited authority and does not offer guidance for municipal or special district elections not being coordinated with the county clerk. The department does not propagate guidance or best practices for elections that it does not oversee. So I don't hear the Secretary of State disagreeing with the idea you all have put forward. They said we do a lot of this, but we would be happy to combine it into a centralized place, but we don't provide best practice guidance to elections we don't oversee. Does anyone have reaction to this or any thoughts of altering this idea or recommendation? Mr. Hines.
We can hope, sorry, Chris Hines. We can hope that that every clerk and recorder of every county in the state knows all the best practices, that knows and can recite Colorado statute and or appropriate ordinance. I don't know if that is if that should be held as true, and so that's talking about someone who may not just may not know all the rules or the laws. And then we have in Mesa County, we have a clerk who willfully went against the laws. And so while I recognize that the secretary does not oversee elections, there should be some entity that makes sure that there are best practices promulgated. And I don't know why it wouldn't be the Secretary of State. So with this particular topic.
Understood. And I don't think there's anything in the Secretary of State's web feedback that prevents you all from advancing this idea as a recommendation and letting folks figure out how to compel local clerks or others to follow the best practices. There's nothing that limits them serving in that role. Any other thoughts or ideas? And Mr. Ortiz has suggested that we, in our recommendation, include notes, and I would call them considerations on implementation, citing the reason needed for some of this. We got through that pretty quickly, so I'm happy to take this to a vote unless anybody has further commentary on it. So the one note that I'm going to have is include in implementation notes the reason this is needed. Although that may also be covered in the problem statement. So again, we can direct the Secretary of State to develop and maintain a guide of ADA and CADA compliance requirements and accessibility best practices for use in any jurisdiction that conducts elections in the state of Colorado. We're voting on this having heard the Secretary say we already do much of this. We can't control what some others do. With that said, I'll go to a vote, and Ms. Hinton, I'll go to you first.
Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Oh my God, this is Chanda. This computer at this volume today, yes. The only thing I would add is like in our last one where we mentioned Secretary of State or we referenced something or any other I would need to open it, but I think that would be the only thing that I would add, or official responsibility of some sort of oversight. But I don't know if that is relevant to this one like it was the one above. If it's not, that's fine. I still say yes, but I just wanted to make sure.
I might suggest, since we're asking them to assemble the best practices,
Okay,
I don't know that you want to ask each individual, and not to pick on anybody out in Mesa County, but I don't know that you want that local clerk creating your set of best practices.
No, agreed. So yeah. Thank you for the clarity.
No, and I'm not trying to lobby anybody anyway on this. Mr. Hines.
Yes.
Mr. Hines, yes. Mr. Towler.
Yes.
Mr. Towler, yes. Mr. Hernandez.
I'm not sure really. There's a new office that just came into play, the Colorado, what is it, Disability Opportunity Office?
That's correct.
Would that be a more appropriate location to be able to offer best practices in this area?
The idea we have in front of us is for the Secretary of State. If somebody wants to propose differently, we can address that idea separately.
I guess where I'm coming from is that's their area. They've established that office to provide guidance at that level.
Rep. Ortiz has his hand up, and I might suggest that we include an implementation note to consult with CEDU and again, other experts and those with lived experience. I'm going to pause the voting and invite Mr. Ortiz in because I think he wants to speak to that specific point.
Yeah, just real quick, this is Rep. Ortiz. The CEDU office is to advise and bring departments together, but they have no legal authority over any of the departments or what they do. And just as Councilman Hines had stated, at the end of the day, like, yes, special districts get control over some of what the election goes, but it is their job ultimately to certify elections. And if special districts were to do something that was not constitutional, like, oh, every 3 votes is only going to count as 1 now, right? Like, there are limits on the local control, even within what the Secretary of State is saying. And I got to go back to what Councilman Hines was saying, is that civil rights cannot be governed by local control. It's not the intent. So for the CEDU thing, no, because they have no legal authority. I don't think this falls in their purview. They can work with the Secretary of State if we make this recommendation and they are charged with doing that, so they can confer with CEDU as a resource. But I just don't see this being housed under CEDU.
With that, and I'm going to come back to Mr. Ortiz for closing remarks. Mr. Hernandez, on the idea as in front of us.
Well, now that it's been explained and I've been educated, then yes.
Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. Mr.
Thank
Callahan.
you, Representative Ortiz.
Mr. Callahan.
Yes.
Mr. Callahan, yes. By unanimous vote, the idea to direct the Secretary of State to develop and maintain a guide of ADA and CADA compliance requirements and accessibility best practices for use in any jurisdiction that conducts elections advances with the implementation note that these should be provided to those conducting local elections, explaining why this is needed, and again, to consult with those with lived experience and subject matter experts. I'm going to start the voting. We are actually at 1 p.m. and at time. I want to thank all of you, and Representative Ortiz, I want to turn it back to you for any closing thoughts.
Thank you all. I just want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Like, it's been really cool listening in and just doing mostly listening this meeting, because it's been amazing to see how you all have come into your own, how the different subcommittees have come into their own. Some of us live this way, but not all of us that live this way understand what it takes to do policymaking and legislating and to turn this into something that can impact and create basic access. And to see the way that y'all have grown in this work has been amazing and a privilege. So thank you so much for giving of your time and your talents and for doing this work. The last thing I want to hit on was kind of what was stated at the beginning around the recommendations. And these are just my personal thoughts on them. I was not surprised, but a little disappointed on hearing the same old. And you guys mentioned it a little bit, but it was either we already do this, or we're not required to do that, or are we the appropriate place to house this, or it's going to be expensive. And you know what I hear when I hear all that? Form it in your mind right now. I hear the same old tired talking points that have always been used to delay or block or deny access for us. Whether it's malicious or not, the result is the same. And I hope that you all stay involved even after the task force is over, because expect this to be a fight. Expect this to be a fight when the recommendations go to the gov's office. Expect this to be a fight when the recommendations go to the legislature. Because what I read from chambers of commerce, what I read from some of the other associations were not surprising, saying that they don't have enough representation here, right? That was another example that was cited. So the follow through is going to be critical. And I hope that you all stay involved in this fight and in this work after the task force is done. So I appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Ortiz. Thank you all. We are back together on November 14th at 11:30. It is currently my intention that is the last meeting on recommendations, but I'm going to very transparently tell you, I'm not going to rush you on any votes. So we may need a final short meeting after that, but we will do everything we can to get through the remaining items. November 14th at 11:30. I would just ask you to come to that prepared, having digested the feedback that we've received. Thank you all for a super